doing the recording. That'll be on our Twitter feed early next week. Right, well, we're up in the 140s now. So because of that, can I ask that people switch off their cameras? Because Zoom says when you have a large meeting, if people switch off their cameras, it means you'll still be able to see the speaker and hear the speaker, but it reduces the amount of data that has to be transmitted. So hopefully it will stop the speaker sort of stuttering. Sometimes it's a lot of people, you get the signal starts getting problems. So if people could switch their cameras off, thank you. Now I'll hand over to Ian to introduce Christine.
Hello, greetings. Welcome to the February meeting of the Essex branch of the Historical Association. Let me cast our minds back to where all this began in January 1906 with a couple of teachers, Miss Howard and Miss Reed. And they were very interested in buttonholing their old lectures and trying to keep up to date with teaching and learning. People seemed to like the idea of meeting. And in May 1906, the very first meeting of the full association began with a round total of 35 people. Well, I got in touch with head office yesterday, and the figures for the National Association as of yesterday are 9,844. Gosh, how we've become a throng. But not surprisingly, how can teachers meet these days and get information, except maybe through an organization like this? Well then, we begin with teachers, and that's not the be all and end all of the HA. Very early on, general members, those who love history, teaching and learning beyond the classroom, attached themselves to our organization too. And picture yourself only 50 years ago. Here is a young Essex teacher trying to do GCSE history and A-levels and doing an apparently interesting job. Well, I thought so anyway, teaching world history, GCSE, and 17th and 18th century British and foreign through the Oxford board. We prepared our students as best we could. We gave them the books, we gave them our notes, and we discussed how to prepare to answer questions, answering the question put in a cogent, literate way, and maybe even coming to some sort of significant conclusion at the end. Oh, happy days. But then there were two huge winds of change that swept through teaching and learning. The first blew out of Trinity and All Saints College in Leeds with the school's history project, SHP. And this was a system, no, it was textbooks, teachers, an exam, and marking, all dedicated to what history was about. And pupils were given a share of what history is. They were asked to look at a development through time. And gosh, were these teachers committed? Some of them were heretical. They wanted to know why, if a youngster had got the concepts, the ideas, even though their expression was faulty, why they couldn't get the full marks. And it was very interesting listening to these committed teachers. Well, that was one force of change. And then came another. Out of Cambridge came Christine Counsell. I met her a good friend of the Historical Association, Christine, been at many education conferences, and I've scribbled making notes, and I'm delighted that she is here today to talk about, and I must get this precise, because we're talking about teaching interpretations. Somewhere we have the exact title. Teaching interpretations at key stages 2 and 3. Why it matters and what history teachers have learned about how to do it well. Delighted to have you, Christine. Over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Ian. Really lovely to be here, and it's just great to be doing, what is the most important thing I think for teachers, which is supporting and serving the Historical Association, our wonderful subject association, and all that you do at branch level, and to be doing this as a branch too on a Saturday afternoon is just terrific. So thank you for all you do, and thanks for reminding us there about the origins of the HA. So important, understanding the legacy that we inherit and the responsibility we have taking things forwards. And thank you for that much too generous introduction. I'm absolutely certain that no interpretation would see me compared to the SHP in significance. So I'm going to hold forth really and just talk about how we're all standing on the shoulders of giants, and think about what is our responsibility as teachers of history and everybody involved in the process of history education in continuing to take forward the teaching of multiple interpretations plural within our curriculum. It has been a struggle behind the scenes sometimes over the last 30 years to keep that S on the end of the word interpretations, but it's still there. It's there in the 2014 curriculum that we should teach children about varied interpretations, how they come about, why they're constructed, what they do, what effects they have, and the responsibilities everybody has in relation to them, whether that's scholarship or popular history. It's an absolutely crucial part of the national curriculum, and I always call it the jewel in the national curriculum. And really what I'm going to try to do this afternoon, I'm going to talk for 1 hour, and then there's a bit of time for questions after that. I'm going to talk about how this jewel has been polished over the years and developed, and what we can all do to keep on polishing it and transforming it, whether we are teaching in primary or secondary or working with history teachers or whatever. So what do I mean? What does the national curriculum mean by, and what has it pretty consistently meant by it since 1991? Let's just look at some examples of what we mean by interpretations of the past. There's an interpretation that Saddam Hussein created in 1990. That's his interpretation of the past. If we were together in a room and were able to chat more easily, I'd be asking you what you can see there, but I'm sure as a history enthusiast, you will see that Saddam Hussein is presenting himself next to Saladin. So what's he saying about the past, about his relationship with the past? Is he the inheritor of that tradition going back to the Middle Ages? It's an interpretation of the past expressed by a state through a stamp. And my goodness, it's meant to be powerful, isn't it? It's meant to be doing a job. So there's an example of somebody in power interpreting the past to influence others. Here's another example of an interpretation of the past, a book by David Cannadine, a radical book in which he sought to argue things which went counter to the current trend. He's not just presenting a copy of the past, he's producing an argument about the past, as all historians do. And there we see further interpretations, if you like, layered on top by the reviewers, what they think about it. And it's important, a book that's attracted much interest, much praise, much criticism too. The New York Times says it's an important reminder that human beings have much in common and that they have improved the conditions of their lives, and many others disagree. There's an example of an interpretation that we might want children to understand as an example of what people do to try to interpret the past. And here's another very different example of a work of historical scholarship, The Myth of the Blitz by Angus Calder, which does what it says. It takes apart another interpretation, one that has been carried through popular understanding, and it pulls it apart and says, actually, is this understanding of the Blitz spirit actually warranted by evidence? Two really highly contrasting works of scholarship there. This is what we mean when we're introducing pupils to the practice and product of interpretation. I want to keep going with my examples before we plunge into practical approaches to teaching. What's this? Well, at the first glance, you might think this is about the Chartists, but look very carefully. It's a mural about the Chartists, and it's a mural in Newport, of course, a place where, well, Chartism being very big in Wales, where the legacy, the heritage of Chartism is celebrated. So we can see there, a vote for all men over 21, a wage for members of parliament. Here is this mural sitting in a wall in a town in Wales, in Newport to be precise. It's an interpretation of the past. In this case, it's a celebration of the past. And then we get another interpretation of the past. Look at this. What's going on here? What has replaced the words on those banners? Where was democracy on October the 3rd, 2013, the left one says. And the right one says cultural vandalism. So what's gone on here? Well, here we've got a community who are absolutely furious because a car park is going to be built and it's going to involve removing the mural. So what we now have is a group of people in Wales, or we had in 2013, a group of people in Newport who are interpreting the past. They are angry about an interpretation which they feel is going to be removed, a very physical one, an actual cultural artifact that's part of their town. And they're so angry about it that a huge campaign develops, a Facebook page develops, and they develop their campaign aims. Have a look at these. We want justice for our mural and a genuine public consultation, blah, blah, blah. We want the return of the remains of our remote mural. It had already been destroyed. We want the London developers to underwrite the cost of a new Chartist memorial, and so it goes on. We want the resignation of any councillor or executive proven to have misled or lied to the public. And we want bi-monthly public meetings with the Council on Heritage and Arts from now on, and so on and so forth. And then they start telling the story of it. Now, if we go on the next page on this website in 2013, you see people writing their comments on it and how strongly they felt about the disappearance of this mural, about Chartism, about the history of Chartism in the town. We have the right to remember, someone says, the history of Newport, a history that changed the lives of many. How can you even think of destroying the mural? It's beyond comprehension. It shows an important time in British history, and it happened here in Newport, says Elaine of Newport, and so on and so forth. How can you even contemplate destroying this mural that we all love? It would be nothing short of vandalism. What's going on here? Here we are seeing people who care about interpretations, people who feel like they own an interpretation, people who are thinking about the effect and the consequences of an interpretation for them. So it's extremely personal and it relates to a community, but it also says something, doesn't it, about the interpretive process. It shows that it's not something static. It goes on being renewed. It goes on inventing itself. It's a social process, both the mural itself as a visual, physical interpretation, and then the actions of these people. This website becomes an interpretation of the past. Another example, the Association of Little Ships, which does what it says it does. Here's an example from what the website looked like in 2008. And they do all sorts of activities commemorating the story of the little ships and their heroic action at Dunkirk. But they do various things to continue to represent that past. And they continue to tell stories about those little ships. And now look at how it's sort of getting stronger and stronger. Look at the website now, a very slick website now of the Association of Dunkirk Little Ships in 2021. So it continues to renew itself as an interpretation of the past, an interpretation that has origins and purposes and impact. I'm going to give a couple more examples. What's this all about? Here's a piece I found in a newspaper in 2010, all about the mayor of Anzio in Italy, who decided to build a statue to an emperor, perhaps a rather surprising emperor, to the Emperor Nero. And we all know the stories about Nero, you know, the sort of popular mythology around Nero. We're all familiar with that. And what the mayor of Anzio is going to do, though, because it's the birthplace of Nero, is reconstruct that story of Nero and use it to sell his town. So he develops a new interpretation of Nero, though he claims it's based on other interpretations of Nero, and it's actually hilarious. Look at this. So for 2,000 years, the Emperor Nero has been regarded as a crazed and ineffectual megalomaniac who murdered his mother and first and second wives, set fire to Rome, burnt Christians to death, or had them thrown to wild animals. Yesterday, he was rehabilitated, at least by the citizens of Anzio, the port south of the capital where he was born, and where the remains of his sprawling summer palace can be seen above a sandy cove. Bruscini, the mayor of Anzio, a city best known, unveiled a bronze statue of Nero in a public garden overlooking the sea, observing that it was time the emperor's reputation was reassessed. And this is the bit that I always find very amusing. Flanked by women dressed in Roman costume, Mr. Bruscini said, "It is not by chance that we have erected the statue by the sea and the former Roman port. Various episodes in Nero's life are linked to his birthplace, which he made the seat of an imperial residence, which assumed monumental dimensions, which we can still admire." And he goes on to talk about the plaque. It does not mention that he had his mother Agrippina put to death and divorced and later executed his wife and so on. And so it goes on. So we have this account of Nero. It suits the mayor of Anzio and the citizens to celebrate his past. And so they draw upon historical scholarship too, as we're going to see later in my talk, to create this interpretation. It's an interpretation. It's doing a job. It is part of the traffic of information that human beings receive as we do this thing that only human beings do, which tigers and ants don't do, which is they tell stories about their past. One more example. Let's have a look at how children were taught history in 1838. Really interesting moment to choose. So it's shortly after Queen Victoria coming to the throne, and it's a little rhyme for them to learn about the kings and queens of England. And it just speaks volumes about how certain people at the time wanted to interpret Britain's past and felt other people should imbibe it as an interpretation. And it's terrific. And like every other example I've given you, these have all been used in Key Stage 2 or Key Stage 3 by history teachers to teach children the very varied ways in which human beings as a social process construct the past and choose to pass it on to others. So this rhyme is just terrific. This is Edward I of lengthy limb. Wales was annexed to the realm by him. It's not great poetry. He warred with the Scots with whom he beat, though they rallied again after each defeat. And then it kind of goes back, son of Henry III, whose life we find, and so on. This is Edward II, whose deeds evince that he was a silly and dastardly prince, defeated by Scotchmen at Bannockburn, home with disgrace, compelled to return. A horrible murder concluded his days. His fate we must pity, his life cannot praise. It's really highly moral. Most kings are criticized very heavily, and this really surprises children because they imagine that kings are all going to be elevated and celebrated, and they're not. Most of them are criticized actually in this little account. It's quite interesting. So we then have the weak and the wicked King John, and then we have Henry III, from whose life we find that he, like his father, was feeble in mind, and so on. So what do these forms of accounting, this is what they are, they're accounts. What do these forms of accounting have in common? And you might well be thinking, well, they don't have much in common. How can you put a serious historical scholar alongside, you know, a bit of propaganda or a bit of doggerel or a group of people trying to celebrate something or fight for something? And of course, you certainly cannot appraise them all on the same terms. But that's precisely the point. That's what we need to teach children. We need to understand that there are these different forms of accounting that have different purposes and that have different means of establishing the truth of their claims and different forms of warrants. But this is what they've all got in common. And this is why they sit under this umbrella interpretations and have done in the national curriculum since '91. Each seeks to constitute or construct the past in a particular way. Each is a performance with an audience, involving a community that takes up a call to sustain and nurture it. Each is a social process, and each is a conversation between its own time and a particular set of events from a different, much earlier period. Now, because this is something that human beings do, and they do in community, and it is a source of joy and pride, and it is also a source of great aggravation and contestation. And it really matters, doesn't it? When I've been working with history teachers in those parts of the world that are recovering from conflict, which is probably most of the world. And very often I have heard people shout angrily such things as, the school textbook caused the civil war. I heard someone say that once in Lebanon. And what are they saying there? They're not just engaging in hyperbole, are they? They're stating the seriousness of the accounts we share with children. And of course, We cannot produce some perfect neutral account of the past on which we all agree. It's quite staggering how successive politicians seem to imagine you can, in this country and others, come up with some account that we can all agree on about the past, and then we'll all be happy and we'll all be cohesive. It's never going to happen. But what we can do is help children through a range of different means to understand what it means to have a civilized conversation about the past, to engage in robust challenge about it, and to think about and understand other kinds of accounts, and to make sense of where robust challenge is useful and what one might want to challenge. And we can get children realizing the many, many forms in which this arises. But some of what I've said might sound very familiar. History curriculum in this country has done much of that for a long time, but there's a very particular aspect of it which interpretations is there to achieve, which I want to elaborate. So, in its technical curricular sense, since 1991, it means this. When the main focus of students' work is then how other people in later times have reconstructed, presented, or argued about the past. So it's not about interpretation with a small I. I mean, there's interpretation in every primary source. There's interpretation everywhere. This is very, very specifically, this particular curricular entitlement is not about that which is already well covered in the curriculum. It's about subsequentness. It's about subsequent accounts and how they get constructed. And I just want to illustrate that now with an example of a subsequent account, if you like, of the past. I thought the School of Athens is a great example of this, and it's a super Key Stage 2 example. I have seen it used at Key Stage 3 as well, but beautiful to use at the end of your Romance unit in Key Stage 2, Year 5, Year 6. I've seen it used very effectively. So the School of Athens, really famous painting, I'm sure needs no introduction. Raphael, sometime between 1509 and 1511. So what's going on here? Because we've got all these Greek philosophers and knowledge makers and theorists shown. They did not live all together at the same time. They never appeared together. Most of them didn't live anywhere near at the same time. They're separated by hundreds, if not thousands of years. And they didn't live in this kind of they didn't come, nor was the School of Athens, this kind of a building, which is actually pretty Roman in its influence. And yet Raphael is putting them all together here because he is saying something about the past, isn't he, Year 5? What's he saying? Well, let's start having a look in who's here. There's Euclid. We learned about Euclid last year, didn't we? We learned about Euclid when we were doing the Greeks, interestingly. And of course, most primary schools with a really good, thorough program on ancient Greeks do make sure children study such people as Euclid and Ptolemy, Aristotle and Plato, and understand the significance of these people for mathematics, for astronomy. So the children already know about this through a good, thorough study of Greek art, architecture, culture, and knowledge. And now later on, they can have a look at what subsequent generations have done with this. So what's Raphael up to in the early 16th century in wanting to create a picture which has got Euclid in there doing a bit of geometry? And then who else have we got here? We've got Aristotle and Plato. And oh, look, Year 5, there they are together. And they're holding books. We know, don't we, that those are not the kind of books that they would have held at the time, because books didn't look like that. It would have been much more like, you know, a scroll. It certainly wouldn't have looked like a book that didn't start to emerge like that till we got paper making in China, and then developing further in Muslim empires, and book binding really developing heavily in places like Baghdad centuries later. So why are they holding books? Why has Raphael put them there? And who's he put them with? Oh, look, there's Pythagoras down there. What's he doing? Why is he in the picture as well? And let's have another look. Here's Ptolemy. So there's Ptolemy, you know, from Alexandria towards the end of that period, where we've got a number of great minds coming together, and Ptolemy's there holding his globe. So all of these people together in this painting produced in the early 16th century is saying something. Raphael is saying something about the past. It's written in a particular time for a particular audience. He's making a point. He's clearly celebrating something. What's he saying? Let's analyze, shall we, Year 5, what the message is, what the significance is of these people to a much later time. This is the study of interpretations as it is meant to be. So how did interpretations really get going? Quick history lesson of the history of education. It was great to have Ian gave us a great history lesson at the start about history of the Historical Association, and it's really important to sort of go back and see where we've been in order to both make sure we're not reinventing square or round wheels, and then also to critique what former history teachers have done and make it better. So Macaulay, very famous theorist and practitioner, former history teacher, was commissioned by the National Curriculum Council to really develop this idea of interpretations of history when it was first appearing in the very first national curriculum in 1991. So 1991 was the first time we saw an explicit requirement for all pupils in school to be studying subsequent history. And this was in addition to studying primary sources and evidence and producing arguments and all of that. That's taken as read, that's elsewhere in the curriculum. This was additional. It's saying they must actually be exposed to some real subsequent accounts. So Macaulay worked with hundreds of teachers in a project to gather evidence around what might work in the classroom and to begin to theorize this a little. And he did various things. He, and those of you perhaps who've had a specialist training in history education, perhaps secondary teachers, will know this well from your training. He identified a series of types of interpretation that appear just generally in life all over the place, and scholarship is crucial in there. But one of the things that Macaulay emphasized, which was also very much part of the national curriculum's rationale, was this mustn't just be about historical scholarship. Of course, historical scholarship is central and needed to be more central in school history teaching, but it is about making children aware that the whole world is, fancying it can interpret the past. Everyday artist, politician, popular website is giving you a view about the past directly and indirectly. So we're kind of assaulted by this on all sides. So Macaulay was saying, let's flesh out what this might mean. Let's flesh out the meaning of the curriculum requirement to make sure we're thinking about the range of ways in which the past gets interpreted and represented for whatever reason. There is a sort of updated version of Macaulay's types. He came up with a collection. You can read about it in his article in Teaching History in 1993. But this was then developed at a conference in 2004, actually, as a collection of ways in which teachers till then had started to look at interpretation. So you can see the full range there. Now, Macaulay also posed 5 questions to frame the sorts of things children should do with interpretations, and we're going to come to those in just a moment. And all this was enshrined in some guidance that went out in 1993, and it's well worth, actually, if you've got a dusty copy on the shelves anywhere, going back to that guidance, because it sort of reminds you of the purpose of this. And it ties in, actually, with many current lively debates about children having access to a range of ever-evolving, changing, challenging interpretations. And it also is a very nice challenge, I think, a very, not a nice challenge, a very robust challenge to what we see in some exam boards interpretations, which is most unfortunate and which is really emasculates the very idea of interpretations that we're getting at here. So what I'm going to do now is quickly give you an overview of some enduring principles. This is just my interpretation, but from having worked extensively with a huge range of history teachers, both in teaching itself and in training, and also just seeing a wide range of history teachers work through publication, I've just drawn together here 5 principles which really began with that original national curriculum, but which have, I think, been the things which have sustained and strengthened really great practice with interpretations that's meaningful, that's worthwhile, that complements the rest of the curriculum. And they're quite basic points, but I thought we'd just start in a basic place. So the first principle is subsequentness. Pretty screamingly obvious, but I think that does need to be spelt out. It's vital children are also looking at things like witness testimony from the time. This isn't about that. It is how the past is constituted by others later, whether consciously or unconsciously. Secondly, it's about real ones. Now, if you're wondering why on earth she's saying that, it's because it's a real problem. I still see Key Stage 3 practice where children are given some little statement And they don't even know who it's by. Even if they know who it's by, it's not much use if it's just 3 lines. It's just like a little statement, you know, I don't think shell shock was real, or something like that, or just as kind of a judgment about the past, and then they're asked to give their view on it. That isn't even approaching getting anywhere near the study of interpretations. Where are the children learning about the thing that was actually said by somebody in a context? Is that a piece of scholarship? Is it man on the street who's just chosen to pontificate? What is it that they are looking at as a cultural artifact? And then secondly, how are they supposed to be analysing how it was constructed, how it came about? Why is it that someone has this viewpoint or has built this argument? And what is it? Is it a viewpoint or is it an argument? Often you see very poor practice where that word opinion is used in a very sloppy way. And, you know, really they don't mean opinion, they mean argument, or they mean viewpoint. And it's all just got a bit confused. Great study of interpretations shows children actual interpretations, good chunks of scholarship, or the sorts of things I showed you earlier on, albeit briefly. So a decent chunk of an old school textbook, or a website where someone has actually constructed an account of the past, or something where the account of the past is implicit and needs to be unpacked, but it's a thing, it's a cultural artifact. So what real interpretation are you showing them? Don't just give them a viewpoint and ask them to comment on it. It needs to have a huge range across the key stage. So across key stage 2, how good is the range? Are children bumping into it? Across key stage 3, how good is the range? And this is important too. One of the things in 1991 that both the national curriculum and McAlevey were reacting against was a tendency to drift towards a kind of negative approach. I often used to call it historical helplessness. And it comes from very poor teaching of sources and evidence. I'm sure you all know what I mean. The sort of spot the bias approach to studying primary sources, where children sort of end up feeling that it is all a bit pointless really, because the purpose of history is to spot bias at 100 meters and run around and find those naughty, unreliable sources, instead of realizing that sources actually can be extremely useful precisely because they're biased. And it all depends on the question you ask of the source. So this isn't looking at primary sources, we're looking at subsequent accounts. But the point here is that what we're interested in is how this thing was constructed. And it may be full of inaccuracies. I'm just upfront about that at the start. You know, obviously this is inaccurate. We don't need to waste time, you know, asking whether it is or it isn't. It's obviously inaccurate. It's obviously a fictional representation. That's what it's doing. I'm not going to waste a lesson getting children to work out whether the School of Athens is a fair, true depiction of the past or not. No, I'm upfront with the children straight away about what it is. And then it's a very constructive approach. Let's work out, how did this come to be? Why is it there? What does it tell us about the interpreter? What does it tell us about the subsequent period? What kind of impact did it have? It is, in fact, a deeply ethical process, because it's about thinking through the effect an interpretation has, as well as the origin of it. But constructive in another sense too, that it's about looking at the process of construction. Do look up Arthur Chapman's work on this. He's very good at it in all his publications, and he writes extremely thoughtfully about the process of construction. What sources were used? Were sources used at all? What was this person trying to achieve? What methodological influences were there upon it? And so on. So we're not talking here about how bloody was Mary, or was King John wicked, or, you know, Cromwell hero or villain, because that isn't going to lead children to write about real subsequent interpretations. Such questions may or may not have a place to achieve other aspects of the national curriculum. Fine, there are quite a few problems with them. But if we're wanting children to write about the interpretation or interpretations themselves, it's good to have a big question that focuses on that interpretation. Let's look at those 5 principles at work in our School of Athens painting. So it fulfills all 5 criteria. It's heavily subsequent. It's an actual interpretation. It's a real thing. It isn't, you know, a little statement we've got from nowhere that has no roots. It's a type of, it's only one of the range you'd want to expose children, but it's one of the many types we'd want them to encounter. Our analysis of it has already become constructive. We're asking ourselves, you know, what's Raphael doing here? Why is he doing it? what was available to him, you know, how he's influenced by Leonardo da Vinci. One of the things remarkable about this painting, of course, is perspective. But as a comment on the past, what's it telling us? And our analysis focuses on how and why it was constructed. So, to sum up then so far, interpretations national curriculum is a technical curricular term, and that's why I keep sticking it in inverted commas or giving it a capital I. It's about ensuring that pupils encounter and explore the construction of contrasting interpretations by others. And it's therefore extremely important to think about, you know, a good inquiry question, those questions that knit together our sequence of lessons, that place the force of analysis on those things. Not because there aren't many other kinds of great questions we should ask, but if we're going to give children this curricular entitlement, then we need to actually make sure we do sometimes, whether you do it through inquiry questions or some other means, get children to think about matters such as these. And I've tried to capture a huge range there. I'll give you a moment to take them in. Okay, notice how each of them is subsequent, each of them real, each of them constructive. Why did Shakespeare present Richard III as he did? Why did horrible histories become so popular? Some focusing on origins, some focusing on audience. And I want to stress this too, it's only meaningful in the context of your curriculum as a whole. Sometimes people say, oh, but isn't it important that children build their own interpretations? Yes. That's what they're doing 90% of the rest of the time. Every time you do a causation inquiry and you get the children to build an argument about why, every time you do a similarity and difference inquiry and you look at different ways of grouping or classifying or questioning grouping in the past, you're teaching children, even in early key stage 2, gently, slowly, in embryonic ways, to build little arguments, to realize there are choices, to make decisions, to look at the warrant of what they're saying. You're always teaching children to argue, nearly always, and build their own interpretations. There's no question, but that's important. This is adding a distinctive aspect to the curriculum, and I'm emphasizing it because often it doesn't get added. Have they encountered others? So Macaulife's 5 questions then. I'm going to summarize them really quickly here and then show how they've developed. And these are really useful for helping teachers think through in their planning. The first question he asks is, what kind of a thing is this? Is it a painting? And now, you know, Macaulay was writing before people were using the internet, but now it might be, well, it's a website with this particular purpose, or it is a particular society or association trying to do this, or it's a group of scholars who are trying to seek truth around X or trying to move the debate on around Y. What is it saying? This is the bit that teachers so often miss out. Sort of plunge into something analytic before we've taken time, as I just quickly began to do earlier on as we looked at this picture, taken time to think, why EF5? Why did Raphael want to say all this? But before we get there, before we get to the why, what is being said? What is being said by putting all these Greek philosophers together? What is the painting saying? And then a group of things that Macaulay bunched together as how and why was it constructed. So what's its purpose? What's its intended audience? And what's its relationship with evidence? A really important question. In some genres, there is none. They're not attempting to. And that tells you what, you know, it is and isn't good for. A piece of fiction isn't telling you 10 seconds about the sources that the author might have gone to. You wouldn't expect it to. But it might have a very, very close implicit relationship with the sources. You never know. And what are we seeing here? Are we seeing fact? Are we seeing viewpoint? Are we seeing arguments? Are we seeing the past being imagined? And then finally, how is it affected by its context, whether that's the methodology and sources used or something ideological or a set of assumptions or power relations, patronage or whatever. So those are Macaulife's 5 questions, but over the last nearly 30 years, they have really developed. And this was a based on a revised version in 2004, because history teachers had written so much about this by then and worked out what worked and didn't, that it was possible to develop it a bit further. And I have since developed it. It's based on, I put at the bottom right where it comes from, but I've developed it since then to pick up on a few things too, which teachers are emphasizing at the moment. So for example, many teachers now are trying to get children to see silences in the historical record. So silences about colonialism, for example, or about race. Again, that finds a very natural home with interpretations. Let's look at how interpretations are changing, about how people are questioning assumptions that they might not earlier have had. So that's the same thing, a kind of more up-to-date version of Macalevy's 5 questions. Okay, just a reminder again that all these slides will be available for you. So if you're thinking, oh, I want that, then you can have it. So I'm now in the final part of my talk going to work through a set of points. I'm going to go with some speed, give you lots and lots of practical stuff. So buckle up, and we're going to go very fast through this. So 6 things which I think learning from the past 25 years have taken us further forward still, and which result in some good practical points. These will be ever changing, but they're ways in which we can make sure we're not letting new teachers go out and reinvent the wheel. Let's look at the sorts of things that have already happened. So my first practical tip is this: get them curious about how it was constructed. That doesn't mean let them to work it out themselves, but get them curious about it. Make it interesting. Look at this lovely piece of practice from year 6. It's so gorgeous, this. It's so simple and so easy to do, and it's linking source work with interpretations. So there's Nero, by the way, in case you didn't recognize him, that's Nero. So back to now, and here's Anthony Cam writing about Nero in 1995. This was part of a sequence of lessons where they're gradually getting the children to realize that there are revisionist interpretations of Nero developing. So how do we do that in year 5? Very, very simply. It's a really great literacy activity too. Here is a nice little extract from Anthony Cam, barely adapted actually. It works well. I think there's only 1 or 2 words that have been changed to make it a bit easier for year 5. So Anthony Cam writes that Nero was artistic, sporting, brutal, weak, erratic, extravagant, cruel, and later in his reign almost certainly mad. People whom Nero disliked or was jealous of were sent a note ordering them to commit suicide. An interesting question is, when did these behaviours develop? There is some evidence that there might have been good government in the early years. 5 years into his reign, Nero became totally controlled by corrupt and evil advisors. So here we're seeing an interesting shift, an acknowledgement that actually maybe history has not been sufficiently kind to Nero earlier on, and the whole thing's been overshadowed by apparent violence and craziness later on. So how do the children then look at how Anthony Cam constructed this? Well, one way you get them curious about that is to get some really well-chosen primary sources, which Anthony Cam did use, which is not difficult, going to his footnotes, or might have used. And in this case, the teacher chose ones that he did use. So bits and pieces here: Aurelius Victor, the first 5 years of Nero's reign, Trajan picked out as a golden age of good government. And then we've got bits and bobs from Suetonius, some of which are rather hilarious. The pink one is quite fascinating. The Emperor Nero liked to be popular, and he was jealous of men who were well liked by the people of Rome. No one was allowed to leave the theatre during his performances on stage, and women in the audience sometimes gave birth, and men were so bored that they pretended to be dead and were carried away. One of Nero's games was to attack men on their way from dinner, stab them if they resisted, and then drop their bodies down the sewers. When Nero found himself short, he resorted to robbery and blackmail, and he set fire to the city of Rome. So if we're beginning to get children curious about how a subsequent interpretation, in this case a serious historian trying to sort of weigh things up, one thing we might do is ask ourselves, what kinds of sources might Anthony Cam have drawn upon in order to write this? And it's speculative at this stage. You can usually establish often a piece of historical writing if it's good where they did, but historians very often aren't explicit about their sources all the time. So sometimes, you have to be a little bit speculative, and it's appropriate to be so. And here is an example. The children did it with handwriting, but I've kind of mocked it up, where they have color coded these judgments. And it's quite interesting because they are all judgments. artistic, sporting, brutal and cruel in pink, weak, erratic and extravagant in green, and they've simply color coded it according to which sources they think might substantiate that bit. Very doable and involves the children going back and forth between the source material and the interpretation. That's one of the most kind of obvious approaches, but actually you don't see it that much at Key Stage 2 or Key Stage 3. And it's so simple and easy to do. But remember, the point, it mustn't become some mechanical dry exercise. The point is, let's get interested in how Anthony Cam put this together. Anthony Cam's making a lot of judgments there. What sorts of things might have made him decide on the word sporting, on the word brutal? Second point, situate your activities and knowledge within a clear, purposeful learning journey. I don't think you have to be doing an inquiry on interpretations to be doing interpretations, as you'll see shortly. I think one can be feeding it all the time in indirect ways. But sometimes you do, don't you, want to make a fuss of it? And if you're making a fuss of it, then the particular interpretation needs to sit in a journey. And that journey of lessons, whether it's 3 lessons or 6 lessons, but a journey of lessons that's really cohering. So that inquiry question is absolutely crucial. If we were doing an inquiry question on that passage about the Mayor of Anzio, for example, which we might, then what might be our inquiry question? If we did the Anthony Cam exercise, what might be our inquiry question? Well, the one in the yellow might be our inquiry question for that. Any of the red ones could be suitable for looking at the Mayor of Anzio. But having an inquiry question that doesn't just sort of come up with some kind of glib idea that sounds a bit fun, but actually isn't really what the children are going to answer, asking ourselves, what will they actually answer? And then, you know, when they produce their little essay or their annotated diagram or their little debate or whatever it is, are they actually answering that question? So framing that question is crucial, and all of the questions there will take children to direct thinking about interpretations, which will get there through the knowledge you've given them and the opportunities you've given them to think, and a theme which you'll see emerging already through the knowledge that you have given them about the subsequent interpretation, just as important as the period being interpreted. So here is that fuller example of things that can inform that inquiry journey. And it's this kind of thing that has really structured certain examples I'm now going to show you of some very strong inquiry journeys. Let's take a really recent one. Dan Keats published this only last year. Here's a Key Stage 3 example. He built a terrific inquiry. Do look it up in Teaching History 179. It is a journey the children go on by looking at 3 widely contrasting interpretations of Cromwell. And note that Dan had a prior inquiry where they learn a lot about Cromwell and building their own arguments about him first. So they go into this fairly short inquiry with quite a lot of knowledge of Cromwell. And now they're studying the way Cromwell has sort of subsequently made meaning in a variety of social and cultural contexts. And he took 3 interpretations and looked at them in depth and detail. They're real, they're subsequent, they fill all the earlier criteria. He took a bit of school history, a Ladybird book in 1963. Ladybird books are just a godsend for looking at the 1950s and 60s, never mind their interpretations of the past. He took C.B. Wedgwood, a popular narrative historian writing in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And then he took a song by the Pogues that's highly critical of Cromwell and that reflects ongoing anger about Cromwell because of Cromwell's activities in Ireland. Look at his questions underneath, and you'll see where they come from. So Dan here is not choosing in this particular context to get them to sort of say, you know, is it true, is it right? It's very clear that they each have very different sorts of relationship with evidence. He's rather getting the children to really understand, why do people care about the past? Why do they keep telling these things? So that the Oliver Cromwell Ladybird, but you know, why did people seem to want children to think these things about Cromwell? The book is extraordinarily ambiguous, as though the world of education can't quite make up its mind whether to celebrate Cromwell's strengths or decry him for being a king killer back in the 50s. And then Wedgwood's very, very distinctive writing that we'll look at in a moment as well. And then the Poe's completely different. So how does Dan build his journey? Look at his beautifully crafted journey. His question, how can 3 accounts of Cromwell be so different? And it's strong because it's focusing on those differences, and it's getting through everything from medium and context and relationship with evidence to the people who do this. So the children are gaining a sense of interpretation as a process, and they answer the inquiry question in lesson 4. So it's quite a short inquiry. They just do it over 2 weeks. Okay, so Teaching History 179 if you want to look it up, and you can see how he's used those ideas. He actually goes through them and talks about how he's used them in the context of his inquiry. So, third point, interest them in the agency, the deliberateness, the artistry of an interpretation. This is incredibly important because all this emphasis on context and how we are influenced by our times and our assumptions can actually start to create a sort of determinism, can't it? As though the interpretation just sort of pops out of the period, or everybody thinks like that. And clearly it's not the case. It's much more complex. So interest them in how it's crafted at a very detailed level. We don't want to do this all the time, but every now and again, it is an eye-opener for children. I think one of my favourite recent examples of this, just 2 years ago, are 2 secondary history teachers, David Hibbett and Zeba Patel. And they took the work of Yasmin Khan. Absolutely fascinating. They looked at Yasmin Khan's work that mythologizes World War II. And they looked at how Yasmin Khan interrogates the source record. What is wonderful about this journey, and look it up, they spell out in detail their practical processes, is that they choose to look at methodology. So they say, in terms of showing World War II as being global and the sheer diversity of people participating in it, what sources is Yasmin Khan going to? What methods is she using? And they unpack Yasmin Khan's approach with tremendous detail. And look at how carefully they craft their inquiry question. Okay, so there's the inquiry question. How does the historian Yasmin Khan use evidence to reach conclusions about? And then underneath you can see their rationale for the way in which they've worded that question. I often think a great department meeting is a department meeting that spends an hour wrestling with the wording of an inquiry question, and interpretations is no different. So that will get that lovely clean focus. Let's look at the artistry of a very different historian now. Let's look at the artistry of C.V. Wedgwood, a historian who is not so fashionable now, but well, in some ways coming back into fashion, perhaps because of her narrative powers. Let's just pause for a moment. I think we've got time. I'm just going to read this to you and let you just enjoy it. And I want you to feel the atmosphere. If we were together and this were a workshop, I'd be asking you to write down some words which capture the atmosphere she chooses to create. I wonder why she's doing this. The king stood for a moment, raising his hands and eyes to heaven and praying in silence, and then slipped off his cloak and lay down with his neck on the block. The executioner bent down to make sure that his hair was not in the way, and Charles, thinking that he was preparing to strike, said, "Stay for the sign." I will, an it please your majesty," said the executioner. A fearful silence had now fallen on the little knot of people on the scaffold and on the surrounding troops and on the crowd. Within a few seconds, the king stretched out his hands, and the executioner, on the instant and at one blow, severed his head from his body. A boy of 17. Notice the kind of cinematographic quality of this. Wedgwood shows rather than tells at every stage. So she shows it through the people on the scaffold, the little knot of people on the scaffold. She shows it, and we've now gone out to the boy of 17 in the crowd. So I used to get children to draw this passage, literally draw it, to see what she's doing. She's describing these groups of people everywhere and how they are apprehending it, what they are hearing. Just look at the references to sound and lack of it and what they're seeing. A boy of 17, standing a long way off in the throng, saw the axe fall. He would remember as long as he lived the sound that broke from the crowd. Such a groan as I never heard before, and desire as I may never hear again. Some of the guards and a few of the more determined and dexterous spectators had managed to dip handkerchiefs in the king's blood, or even to scrape up fragments of earth from below the scaffold, or to tear off pieces of the blood-soaked pall. But the king's body had been reverently carried back into the palace, where it was placed in a coffin and taken to the room where it was to be embalmed. Now, you can imagine a lesson built around this. and I want the children to think about, to perhaps drawing it, describing it, how she uses sound and lack of sound, how she uses people's apprehension to pick up on what she's trying to create. You get a sense that she, boy, does she care about Charles I. There's almost a sense of reverence and, oh, look, we see the word at the very end. The king's body had been reverently carried back into the palace. But when we arrive at that word reverently, she's already been reverent. The whole passage has been reverent. So that word's worth picking out, isn't it, in your teaching? Because that is what I call a word that is a window into the text. And I think my other word that would be a window into the text is fearful. And so let's think about what would happen if we replace the word reverently with some other words. You know, what if they were carrying the body furtively? That would change the feel of the whole passage, wouldn't it? What if they carried the body hysterically? We'd lose the spell at that point. What if they carried it cheerfully? I used to get sometimes trainee teachers acting these different ways of carrying the body out. What if they carried it reverently, which they did? What if they carried it reluctantly? They didn't want to carry the body, or weirdly, or incompetently. So this tiny little bit of fun with it, just choosing a single word that a historian chooses to use or anybody chooses to use and asking, if you replace that word with a different one, what would it do? So children feel the artistry and realize this isn't just a copy of the past. People are seductive and we are seduced by their accounts. Another thing you can do is look at Wedgwood's subordinate clauses. Interpretations is nothing if not full of literacy opportunities. So her subordinate clauses seem to be the places where you kind of catch her thinking, suggesting, speculating. So there's two examples there. Charles thinking that he was preparing to strike. I mean, we don't know that he was thinking. We have no idea what Charles was thinking. That's Wedgwood, as the kids would say, making it up. A boy of 17 standing a long way off in the throng. So let's think about how we could replace things in those subordinate clauses in order to be more Wedgwood-like or be less Wedgwood-like. Charles, thinking he was preparing to strike. So here are some examples. Trialed this with some real year 8s some years ago, and these were the things they came up with, and they criticised each other's. And I'll never forget this one. Charles asserting his authority to the last, and the other people's very critical of that, and they said, no, Wedgwood wouldn't have done it like that because it's too in your face. Wedgwood would have been more subtle. Hoping for a last look at his kingdom is rather nice. Or we might do it, mightn't we, with our boy of 17 standing a long way off in the throng. Let's replace that subordinate clause. Suddenly fearing God's wrath. Excellent. Trembling at the sight of the king's humility. Excellent. Or now let's have fun, year 7, year 8, and let's pop in some ones which she definitely wouldn't have written. Right. And so we go on, but little things which allow children to be fascinated by the artistry. So my next point is knowledge really matters. Interpretations work goes wrong, I think, when people construe it as a skill. It's not a skill. It's about an application of knowledge, and it's about thinking with that knowledge. And this is particularly important, I think, if you do one of these lovely studies of interpretations through time. This is perhaps the most famous one, popularized by the super textbook of Dale Banham, working with Ian Dawson. And they have a whole textbook where they look at John, and there's a section on it on interpretations of John through time. And as many of you will know, it's possible to track interpretations of John through time, and while one must be careful about interpretations, there are some really interesting fluctuations according to the period in terms of the various accounts. So we have this negativity about John by the monks who are writing about him at the time, and then the whole business of breaking with the Pope and being at war with the Pope means you get some positive interpretations of John in the Tudor period. Then you get these negative interpretations of John again, and then things shift again in the 50s and 60s, but often because of different methodological approaches that are available. And then again, well, what's happening now with how people are interpreting King John? Now, if children are going to do this, if you're going to get them to look at this over time, they do need knowledge of these subsequent periods, or it's just completely overwhelming. And this is why great interpretations work, I think, is often best at the end of the key stage. And what a way to revisit earlier knowledge. So let's say, just go back to our School of Athens. Let's say you'd spent much of your time on ancient civilizations, as you do in primary. And in year 6, you're doing a theme that goes beyond 1066, and you're perhaps doing a world theme. Maybe you're looking at Renaissance. And that might be the moment you're looking at art through time, perhaps. And that might be the moment when you're going to choose to look at the School of Athens. And what a great way to make sure children haven't forgotten about Euclid or Pythagoras or whatever. And here, this is ideal to do when they've long finished the Middle Ages. It's ideal to do in year 9, but you can do it in the Middle Ages as well. Some people, sorry, you can do it in year 7 as well. And some teachers have done that very successfully. Here's another example with the Battle of Rorke's Drift. So many depictions of the Battle of Rorke's Drift, ever-changing, popular, scholarly. Do look up Super Piece by Fullard, Wheely and Fordham in Teaching History 142, where they look at, for example, things like Elizabeth Butler's painting, and they look at different kinds of interpretations within scholarship and within art to think about how it changed over time. Here's an example of something that one of the children wrote, because naturally one of the interpretations they used was a bit of the film Zulu. So this pupil is connecting what they're seeing in the interpretation to what the audience might have wanted at the time, to the director's intentions, to the market of the film. There are so many important ways, I think, in which a study of interpretations becomes a fascinating social study. It enables you to be thinking about those conversations between the past and present, and give you a space too in which to talk about some of the more challenging and delicate issues as well. What about interpretations of the ending of the slave trade? I put that in interpretation in inverted commas, because of course we know that it certainly didn't end, and for many people, but the technical ending of the slave trade. Well, there's this very old worksheet here, which is an example of interpretations work back in the 1990s, which actually I'm seeing people do now and often do much better. But it's like it's sort of been dormant for a bit. And now people are starting to take much more interest in the importance of broadening out one's interpretations about why both the slave trade ended and why slavery ended, or how far it did end, and also how far the experience of Black people's actually changed even as a result of it. So here you've got, you know, your 3 classic interpretations, your great good men, your Wilberforce Clarkson-centered interpretations. You've got your more Marxist interpretations. So you've got, you know, Eric Williams and the whole issue of the fact that it might be influenced by the price of sugar falling. And then you've got the interpretation of, hang on a minute, what about Black agency? And if you broaden this out too beyond the British context to include the Haitian Revolution, which is something that really wasn't taught at all until recently, that's where interpretations, I think, has a wonderful effect of pushing us to broaden the content we teach. Then it becomes an absurdity that people were not thinking and writing about the role of Black agency in ending the slave trade. So we might with some of our activities look at examples of scholarship, and just as a very preliminary, straightforward activity for some children, just to clamber into this, think about which broad category of interpretation these might fit into. And I've just taken 3 examples there of the sorts of things that you find that are wholly different understandings. I first did a version of this inquiry with my bottom set, year 9, a very long time ago, millions of years ago. It was when I was early in my teaching career. And I'll never forget how even the lowest attaining pupils were able to understand, by moving into it very, very slowly, that these are fundamentally different premises around an explanation of why the slave trade ended. And again, we can match statements to it. There's no list of shortage of things that we can do to achieve this. Let's take another example of that, of where knowledge really, really matters to make this work. This is an example that comes from Saffron Walden County High School in Essex. So I thought it'd be nice to have an Essex example of teachers developing this. And this was developed in the early 2000s, some well-known films of Native American peoples. How does our knowledge of the subsequent period help us to understand something about how and why these films took the form they did, gained the impact they did, and gained the critique and debate and challenge they did. Well, what did the children learn? The children gained knowledge about different periods of American history. And here they are. This is just a crude summary. Obviously, the children didn't just do it. And this links back to my point earlier about when are you going to do this? Are you going to do it, you know, during the period being studied, or are you going to do it in the period of the interpreter? And there are many advantages to doing the latter. So if you're doing a study of late 20th century American history, why not in that context do your study of how did film change in terms of its interpretation of Native American peoples? And here you can see the sorts of factors that may or may not have influenced certain kinds of filmmaking and certain directions, going all the way up to the 1990s. You know, shifting through to films like, say, Dances with Wolves, which was just so different from some of the films earlier on. So the message I'm stressing here with this one, remember, is knowledge. It's knowledge that they need, and how you build it, just giving them these little boxes is absolutely not the answer. It's about thinking, isn't it? About the journey of lessons, of how you'll steadily build that knowledge and how they will reflect on its relationship with the object of inquiry, which is your interpretations. Here in Saffron Walden County High School, these were the inquiry questions that they toyed with to think about, to frame the children's work. In the end, they went for the fourth one. Okay. Impossible to attempt this sensibly without deep, thorough knowledge of changes in American economy and society. So it's an exercise in knowledge building as much as in thinking. So we're nearly at the end now. And the last two are just kind of cautions, just notes of caution to be careful about, things that can go wrong. Be careful, I've hinted at this earlier, at giving an idea of determinism. Just be very, very careful that because you're stressing the context, you're not sort of flipping the other way. It's all about judgment. It takes a lot of experience, I think, to teach interpretations well, and it needs a lot of discussion within a community of teachers, whether primary or secondary. And what I mean by determinism, or the danger of an epistemology of voice, is brought out very nicely in this example of a move me on. You'll see this in the back of every edition of Teaching History. These are little examples of supporting trainee teachers. And here they're imaginary examples of trainee teachers having particular problems. And this one's great because you can look this up on the HA site. It's an example of a trainee who's just gone a little bit too far in stressing epistemology of voice. And therefore her teaching of interpretations has got really reductive. And this Move Me On is like a kind of national agony aunt thing around training teachers. And so various people write in with solutions. If my trainee was making this mistake, this is how I would support their knowledge, thinking and reading to improve them. So here we have, you know, Helena Swanwick and her difficulties that she's having in teaching interpretations. And here is the worry of Helena's mentor. So you can see, this is why I think it requires sophistication and judgment. When I was training history teachers at Cambridge, I spent 4 full days of the 38 days we had for training our history teachers, 4 full days on interpretations, and spaced it out. And that's not including practice in school and discussion with mentor and reading and tasks, because it's hard and you need time to think about it. And I think if you're working with teachers who haven't had that training and experience in reading, then you want to build yourself a little program over time of reading a bit here and a bit there and discussing it in order to take it forwards. Otherwise, you can easily slip into this kind of error, this kind of mistake. And of course, one way of solving problem 5, just to remind you, is to go back to number 3, interest them in the agency, deliberateness and artistry of the interpretation. A really good example of this, I think, of doing it well, is to look at those murals in Northern Ireland. What a fantastic example of interpretations. And a super piece, which I won't say anything about, there won't be time to discuss it in detail, is Emma Norcliffe's article in Teaching History 204, Time, Place and Identity. And through that, she unpacks how she got her pupils to make sense of the murals as interpretations. So she looks at time, she looks at place, she looks at identity, and she gets them thinking through in a way that doesn't involve stereotyping people in Northern Ireland. That's the challenge here, in order to begin to deconstruct how these murals emerged and what effect they have in Northern Ireland. And so that comes to my last point. It's only a curricular entity. You don't have to teach it separately. Sometimes people get very hung up on it and say, you know, is this an interpretations query or is it something else? Well, that does matter if you're worrying about making sure they get their curricular entitlement. That's what this is about. You know, are they looking at some real interpretations and asking these questions, or are they just making some random thoughts on a judgment? But that doesn't mean that we don't learn about it connected with other things. So let's think about how that connection with other things occurred. And I thought I'd conclude with a Key Stage 2 example to illustrate this. I'm currently working with about 60 primary schools in Haringey, and with others I have resourced a Key Stage 2 curriculum for them. And here's just a tiny bit from our work on Indus Valley. And we're not, you know, screaming interpretations. This is for year 3. We're doing something on sources, and it's the first moment where we teach them about source and evidence. And what a place to learn about source and evidence. The Indus Valley, as primary colleagues will know, is such fun, because if you do, as I always would do, if you do the Indus Valley after you've done Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, the children come to the Indus Valley and go, where are the monuments? Where's the writing? Oh, there seems to be some writing, but we can't read it. So who are the rulers? What religion did they have? All the things we knew about in Egypt and Mesopotamia, we're just not sure about in Indus Valley. But there's such a wealth of sources. So this inquiry that I've developed for year 3, they do it in spring 1, year 3 on the Indus Valley, is really about sources and evidence and building their knowledge of the Indus Valley. And our big question is, how do we know about the Indus Valley? So it's very year 3 centered. And here's just a random PowerPoint slide. But I want to show you how it prepares children for interpretations. It prepares them for the reality that there are people called historians, called archaeologists, who do this stuff. And we need to show pictures of them, and current ones in Pakistan doing this, not just, you know, the white ones from decades or a century ago. So we have this little thing where we do, are you ready to try to solve a puzzle? And we prepare them to look at some sources through which they solve the puzzle. Did the Indus Valley people make music? And of course, if you know anything about the Indus Valley, you can see exactly what we're getting at here. The dancing girl, the little, that gorgeous little clay whistle, seems to be a whistle. And then on one of the seals, is it a harp? Maybe. Okay, so when we gradually build, the children have a go, and then we reinforce the message that yes, blah, 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 blah. So, and then we're reinforcing, practicing our word source and our word evidence, lots of whole class oral work, and so on. It's all very year 3, and it's all very source and evidence. And how is this related to interpretations? But then gradually, having done that, we then move in to make a mini museum. And we start thinking about how people present this. It's our first think about a museum. What are museums trying to do? What are they for? And that what museums doing, what are museums for, is preparing them to think about interpretations and doing some direct work on museums in years 5 and 6. So we're laying the foundation. And here at the end of the lesson, we start looking at the real people who do it. And we look at actual archaeologists at work, what they're doing as they recreate things. So moving on to having done that, we then start to try and solve some of these mysteries and puzzles and show them what archaeologists are actually doing and the products that it results in. So that's an example in year 3 of laying the foundations, getting used to the idea. There are these experts called historians and archaeologists. This is what they do. So Summing all up then, 6 ways, remember I'm going to leave these slides with you, 6 ways in which history teachers have developed interpretations over time. I like to think of interpretations as the jewel in the crown, but like all jewels, there's a few things we need to protect it and keep it safe. We need to polish it and make sure it shines. And I think the thing about a jewel is it looks best if it's set in something, and set in some jewelry, or set in here a crown. And interpretations only works if it's sitting in a wider, better curriculum. It won't work on its own as a trajectory of skills. Often if I'm reviewing a department's practice or some primary history, I say, what's the relationship between your teaching of interpretations and your development of other things, like teaching children to argue, learn about evidence, and crucially, building their knowledge. There are the aims of the national curriculum. There's interpretations down the bottom, right at the bottom, but it fits and sits in everything else. And it's plural. We must keep it plural. And when people like me are dead and gone, you guys must go on fighting to make sure it stays plural, because there's plenty of places in the world when it isn't. If you want to read something about this, then go to the What's the Wisdom On series in the Historical Association's website. Use your membership of the HA to access the various What's the Wisdom On, where you'll see a summary of all these points. There's a What's the Wisdom On interpretations of the past, and there's also a little video accompanying it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Very, very interesting. I'm looking at the questions. I think there's only been one specific question so far.
There's one there, isn't there, Ian? What are the main considerations we need to take into account to ensure they drive students through the curriculum? It's a question really about inquiry. I'm not quite sure what the questioner means there, whether it's a general point. When developing inquiry questions, what are the main considerations we need to take into account? Okay, I think I know what that means. And I think the questioner there is talking about when you're wording those inquiry questions, I think you want to be thinking about the scope of content that it will meaningfully embrace. So I always think about the scope in terms of the substantive content, and then think of the scope in terms of the big disciplinary idea. And if your inquiry questions are a bit too sort of quirky, and they're quite amusing, but they're not actually clear around that scope of content or the big disciplinary idea, then they can go wrong. But I think the other thing to say about and driving it across the curriculum as a whole is that they should resonate for pupils over time. So, a causation question you do in year 6, the teacher wants to be able to say, oh, this is a bit like, but not quite like the one we did in year 4, and same at Key Stage 3. And so it's the same for interpretations. We did interpretations before, didn't we? But we're asking a different kind of thing this time, aren't we? So I think the inquiry question itself is a great way to knit your curriculum together. The children should be spotting resonances between them by similarity or contrast.
Okay, there's somebody, Alex O'Halloran asked, I would be really eager to see some examples of good fruitful outcome tasks for interpretation inquiries, if you have time.
Yeah, I think we probably haven't got time to go and fish them out now, but if you go back into the presentation, you'll see I did give a little clip of the one about Battle of Rorke's Drift, which I think is an interesting example of high-level performance. I think the best way to get a lot of examples of that is simply go to the articles in Teaching History, some of which I mentioned here, and some of which are referred to in the What's the Wisdom On. And if you look in, there are lots and lots of examples there where authors have included data in the form of children's work. So you can see weak and strong outcomes. I will just mention a poor outcome. Sometimes if people, you can tell when the outcome's just not worth having, can't you? When people have just done something that's not really interpretations, they've just given you some sort of statement and the children ask, do you agree with this statement? And they waffle off in all sorts of directions. They're not focusing on it. So I think a sign that the outcome's doing the job is perhaps this is screamingly obvious, that the children are answering the question in ways that are grounded in period knowledge, both the period being interpreted and the period of the interpreter.
There's a question from Rachel Short. Interpretations in our key stage 3 are currently not done well. In Y7 half term 4, we cover church relations, ending with Becket and Henry II. I want to return to Becket when the students have a solid knowledge of the facts in half term 6. When do the restoration discussions, how to interpretation differ? How he was used by Catholics and Protestants in different ways. Do you have any advice on how we to do this well?
Yeah, well, we'd need longer, wouldn't we, Rachel? So I won't say, but I think you've already got the answer, which is how Catholics and Protestants have used that story. I would go in really simple. You said year 7, I would go in really quite simply. I would go into, that thing that was a bit of a national institution, which was the New Year's Eve, that the Archbishop of Canterbury always talking about Becket. So you sort of get a sense of how it's become iconic through time in a general way, before you get into any issues about Catholicism and Protestantism. So I think my first bit of advice is take time for year 7 to understand how something becomes iconic more generally and somehow transcends its time and gets told. And then having built on that, so they've got a sense of it, then move into your nuances. And in terms of how it's been used within Catholic and Protestant traditions, I would definitely not do it until after you've done the Reformation, because it really is, I think, pointless to be talking about Catholic and Protestant interpretations. Oh, thank you. There we are. If they haven't yet done the Reformation. So, I think that's one where I think I would definitely do it much later. And it's a wonderful way in year 8 or year 9 to warm up your medieval knowledge, or their medieval knowledge.
There's a question here from John Edgar, who I don't know if you want to ask it directly, John.
Hi, Christine. Nice to see you again. One of the things that I'm hitting quite a lot when I speak to teachers, particularly in Key Stage 2, is and I know you're probably going to groan when I say it, but Ofsted's new definition of learning. I used the word "new" in inverted commas.
Yeah.
And obviously, what a lot of us are working towards trying to support primary schools in doing the very things that you've described this afternoon, particularly through developing good inquiry questions for their sequences of learning. How far do you think that this new emphasis that Ofsted has might in some way undermine that process?
I think it definitely won't, and it really shouldn't. I would say there was a bigger problem before, with a lack of emphasis upon knowledge, which would mean that so much of interpretations work, insofar as it was done at all, was often very, very superficial. So I think now that it's a golden opportunity for primaries, if you're worried about, not that we should be doing anything for Ofsted, but it's a golden opportunity to show Ofsted how strong your knowledge teaching is, how thorough it is, by taking some carefully chosen, not too many, well-planted, well-positioned inquiries that you do in years 4, 5, or 6. Just one in each year is absolutely fine. Maybe covering 3 or 4 lessons, and then showing how actually doing the inquiry, that working through the activities and producing a decent piece of work at the end, requires children to recall their earlier knowledge, and secondly allows the teacher to check that knowledge is secure. So a good inquiry outcome, I always say, it both develops and demonstrates the pupil's knowledge. So it's a really good example, of instead of just saying, well, let's have a multiple choice quiz to check they can still remember who Euclid is, which you can do, which fine, has its purpose, but instead let's do this thing where they've got to remember Euclid, and they've got to remember Aristotle, and they've got to remember Plato, and they're going to put it to new use, and they're interested to see it again. So interpretations is the most golden way, I think, to do retrieval of prior knowledge, reuse it, see the point of that knowledge as well.
Brilliant, thank you.
There's a question from Aaron. How does one deal with controversial interpretations? Does it have a place in the classroom? How does one tackle it?
My short answer to that is do interpretations. When I'm working in Lebanon or Cyprus, are 2 post-conflict zones that I had a lot of experience in the last decade, where you're walking on hot coals if you open your mouth concerning history, particularly history close to home. and they're really struggling to find a space in which they can have civil, responsible conversations about the past. Everything is just so contested and so painful. So that is a setting where, you know, contested, controversial history is just alive, really, whether it's the recent or the distant past. And the ways in which we're able to move forward are by doing interpretations well. So I think when you're presenting contrasting accounts of the past, taking time to clamber in to why it is that this particular community might arrive at this viewpoint, and taking time to take it apart and say, you know, sometimes non-judgmentally, often suspending judgment is extremely important. People think that the way to be ethical is to sort of get in there and make a judgment. In fact, I sometimes think the way to be ethical is to model what is essentially ethical about historical practice, the intellectual integrity. And so show how you are going in and saying, what can we say about this in terms of what's viewpoint, what's arguments, what's imagined, what's point of view, what is factual, how is this person constructed, what has the artistry resulted in, what is it saying? And I think the answer, there isn't a complete answer to this, because there are some that I think are too sensitive perhaps to go into. But in terms of preparing children to talk about those things, of just making them aware that some people have arrived at really very, very different understandings. The tip I would give a further practical tip. I think it is worth reflecting on what you don't really want to bring into the scope of interpretations. I wouldn't bring in something like Holocaust denial. I think the moment you start calling that, I mean, technically it's an interpretation, I suppose, and my definition earlier, but the moment you start putting that in and you start sort of being neutral about something like that, when it is so obviously wrong, then I think actually you'll go and you open up the possibility that children might, you know, think of it as a viewpoint or an argument, then I think you are creating something really very dangerous. With much older pupils, and this is where I wish GCSE and A-level were much better. I think if there were progression in interpretations, then it would really help. With much older pupils, I think I would want to ask them, why do you think there are people on the planet who seem to want to pretend this didn't exist? But my premise would be it's obviously wrong. I don't think I'd go there with younger pupils, but I would hope that the rigor with which I approach this and all other aspects of it would act as an inoculation against pupils being able to be taken in by such a thing. That's not a complete answer to your question, Aaron, but it's a good one. I hope that gives some food for thought.
There's a final question from David. You mentioned interpretation suiting the end of an inquiry with students having the knowledge to unpick them. Given that students can usually spot the difference between interpretations quite easily, have you come across them being used in the opposite way, to start with an interpretation study and then use that to look at the different time periods? Would it be viable?
Yeah, sure. And I think you can do anything, can't you? I mean, you could use your interpretations as your stimulus to kick it off, couldn't you? I think as long as you felt the children could comprehend them and understand them, and it gave them enough mental furniture to work with, I don't think there'd be anything wrong with starting off with those two. And actually it links to my 6th point about, you know, not imagining you've always got to teach this thing in isolation. I think it is useful sometimes to isolate it, but as with all planning, sometimes you isolate, sometimes you integrate. That is planning, isn't it? You're just always making that choice. So I think there are times when your end point of the inquiry might be something quite different. Perhaps you want them to enter into the argument about the ending of the slave trade, but you just choose to bring in 2 interpretations to kick it off as your initial stimulus to get them going, to frame the whole thing. Provided their prior knowledge and prior thinking activities give them enough access to it, yeah, absolutely. Depends what you want to achieve.
Someone said that Debbie had a hand up. Do you have a question, Debbie?
Yeah, I've actually put it in chat now. It's just a very general one. So most of your lecture has been about to teachers. I'm not in this situation, but I don't know whether anyone else is. There must be people who are homeschooling or home learning, and I wondered how this has been affected, you know, how interpretations.
What a great question, and what a hornet's nest. I mean, it's such a it's such a difficult thing to teach well, And if I think so, I think the only sensible thing I can say is to hats off to parents for even trying. But it perhaps what a useful thing would be to say, it shows how much more conversation there is yet to be had and ought to be had between schools and communities of professionals such as history teachers and parents and the public, so that these things are understood. So I think it's highly likely that a lot of parents have no idea about these debates and would have no idea suddenly seeing some task whether it was even meant to be interpretations, and would certainly have no idea about whether it was any good, or actually, because often parents are very good at spotting whether what's going on is any good, they might look at it and think, well, this is really a bit worrying, this is a bit rubbish, and they might be right. They might well be right. So I think it's a golden opportunity for parents, first of all, to talk to the school and find out, what were you trying to achieve here? And it's a golden opportunity for schools to share such things as the what's the wisdom on piece that I mentioned at the end, or any other just nice, crisp examples, so parents can see what is meant to be being achieved around interpretations. But it's exactly the sort of area where, if what the children have been given is not really up to scratch, it would cause parents to ask questions. And I think, we can either see that as something very fruitful that might actually improve things, or we can see it as a problem.
I was also thinking that parents might think, oh, I'll add my own bit to this and completely overload the child.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you were a parent, you didn't realise what was. I think there are two really big dangers here. One is that the parent really has no idea what we're trying to achieve, and yes, massively sort of makes mess of it. But another worry too is, I think, that the school, perhaps, not their fault, but because of lack of training or whatever, hasn't done a great job. The children have been asked to do something that's wildly inappropriate. Or insensitive, it often happens, or just naff, here's a little statement, do you agree with it? Oh, now you've done an interpretations activity. And then the poor parent is having to mediate that in some kind of sensible way.
Tom Patterson's got a question.
Oh, hello, Tom.
Hi, Christine. Sorry to bring up the devilry word of exam boards, but a couple of years ago on the EdXL paper, I was a bit shocked in the interpretation section, which, as you know, is done incredibly badly. They used a website for their interpretation. It just got me thinking a bit about how, when we're teaching, is there a particular approach you'd suggest for dealing with online sources? I like the point you made earlier about being able to go to footnotes and look at the basis behind a historian. I'm struggling a bit with how we do that with websites.
It's really hard to generalize, because a website can be doing so many things and is so many things, so very, very hard to generalize. A little bit of me, who is normally an arch critic of nearly everything that the exam boards try to do around interpretations, I think some boards are better than others. I mean, I think OCR has made a decent fist of it, but let's not get into that. But a little bit of me actually is at least quite pleased at the idea of using a website, because at least that is a real thing, it is an artifact, and at least you can interrogate it by saying, well, why is this there, and where, at least it's not just giving them some judgment and asking them to give their view on it or something. So part of me thinks it's a good idea. It really depends on the website, Tom, doesn't it, as to what kind of information it gives. But I think what you can do, I suppose, is give children, and many departments have developed this very well, kind of strings of basic questions that you would automatically take to a website. So if you're going to a website to look up, I don't know, anything from Aristotle to, the Bay of Pigs or anything, you would go to that website, wouldn't you, wanting to know certain things about, what is this? Is this something that is being put together by scholars? Let's have a go at it now. Is it something that is gathered, and is it curated collections of scholarship by others? Straight away, that's a distinction, isn't it? Yeah. So, because the moment someone's curated it, then someone has made a decision. So in trying to unpack it, they may not be, that might be totally innocuous and good reasons, but nonetheless, they've made decisions. They've told a story by choosing this scholarship and not that. So is it, first of all, what is it? Is it scholarship? Is it collections of scholarship? Is it something else altogether? Is it, the site of the Association of Little Ships, or whatever? And then in the context of the genre that it is, okay, this is scholarship or curated scholarship, or this is a museum online, or this is whatever. In the context of the thing that it is, okay, now let's go in with those Macaulavy's questions. Where
Yeah.
are the facts? What's imagined? What's points of view? I think those questions actually do give you a really good basic structure to take to anything.
That's great. Thank you.
There was Hugh B had a question. I don't know if you could ask that, Hugh.
Hiya, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. I just want to first say, thank you so much, Christine, for your time today and the talk. It's been really interesting, really
I
fascinating.
enjoyed it.
I was just wondering, I started at a new school recently, and we're on our source units, the Crusades and the Industrial Revolution. And each question is kind of based around the word useful. So I put in the chat, how useful is the source for understanding Saladin's characteristics? How useful is the source for understanding why there were high mortality rates in industrial towns? And I was just wondering if you thought if this was in any way kind of limiting or could be improved, because.
Okay, yeah. I think it is. I mean, we're in a slightly different territory here, so we just try and reply to this one quickly. We're talking about evidential thinking and using sources, which is very different territory from, because I think you'd say, how useful is this interpretation? Or
yeah,
you'd be doing something quite different. But if you were doing evidential work, one way in which those questions have got better is at least people do now stick 4 on the end of them. So, once upon a time, when I first started teaching, there was an awful lot of people saying, how reliable is this source?
Right.
Question mark. Or how useful is this source? It's utterly meaningless. You can only ask those questions in relation to something, can't you? How useful is it for? How reliable is it for? And at least sticking something on the end of it does make it better. Unfortunately, I think it is an example of the necessary limitations of trying to find some exam formulation, and therefore it's one of those stems that's ended up as the exam way of doing it. And my advice would say is understand it as that. It is the exam way of doing something, because you are constrained in how you can put together exams, to be fair to examiners. It's the exam way of doing anything. It's got many, many limitations. And I would say that getting children to think about the utility of a source for a particular question rather than a topic, a question is better than that. So instead of just in the chat, you've got well, you've almost got a question there. How useful is this source for understanding why there were high mortality rates in industrial towns? So that's almost a question, isn't it? Yeah. So as long as it's a question, that's quite handy. But the most important thing is that your overall teaching of evidential thinking across the key stage is not tied up with questions like that. There are so many dimensions to evidential thinking, and teach those, build it up steadily. That will help enormously for handing these nugatory little daft questions they have to do at GCSE, but they won't get better at those GCSE questions by practicing them early. And one reason I'm very pleased that Ofsted is now so critical of using GCSE questions at Key Stage 3 is that. Thank goodness. Because it will stop this sort of practice of imagining that you're teaching evidential thinking or worse still interpretations by doing the GCSE questions. They're not meant for that purpose. You can't teach them through that. They're there to do a particular job in a particular setting much later for older children. So prepare them properly and don't use GCSE questions as any guide to what is worthwhile in teaching either interpretations or evidence. There, I've said it very strongly.
Okay, thank you so much.
There's no more questions. I'll hand over to Ian.
Okay.
Hello, Christine. You can be our agony aunt anytime. And by way of thanks, I'd like to ask Paul to propose our pleasure at having you today.
Thank you, Ian.
On behalf of the Essex branch of the Historical Association, Christine, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for your talk today. I went online this morning and looked at your very impressive, not to say terrifying CV, but in actual fact, like all brilliant teachers, you have reduced a highly complex subject to something that is accessible to everyone here today. I thought it was really quite inspiring. As a former teacher of 40 years experience, history teacher in secondary schools, there was so much there I think for me, even now, to think about, you almost, but not quite, have got me thinking about going back into the classroom. Not quite, but I think you've raised so many issues here. I mean, when you talked about Newport, here in Colchester, we have a student housing development plan, part of which involving access to a car park involves demolishing part of the town's 2,000-year-old Roman wall. And it's caused just the same sort of outcry here. But I think as a teacher, teaching interpretations was one of those things that I think the children really, really enjoyed, because not only did it teach them about the past, it opened up their world around them, I think, when they studied the work of historians and things like that. So thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for listening. Enjoy the rest of your weekends.
Don't go away, please, everyone. Just